Hi there, folks. I'm Brian Crehan. I'm the chair of Kildare North Ógra Fianna Fáil, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by Dr. Anastasia Elle of Umbrella Lane, and she's here to talk to us about sex work. Just going on from our most recent event with Dr. Caroline West and Kate McGrew, talking about sex work regulation in Ireland. We're going to get a Scottish perspective on this and how she's fighting the fight over in Alba. Hi there, Anastasia. How are you? Just question one, tell us about who you are and the work you do. What got you inspired to fight the fight for sex workers?
Okay. Hi, Brian. Well, it's lovely to be here with you. So yeah, the work that I do, I guess I might flip that question, because the work that I do now is very much around how I first became inspired to fight the fight for sex workers' rights here in Scotland. And that started out as a student at the University of Glasgow, where I was very kind of immersed in feminist literature, feminist study, and the one issue that I just couldn't get my head around in terms of feminist debates, well, in fact, two issues, was prostitution and pornography. And it always interested me how there was such a divide amongst feminists on these issues. I really felt at that point that I wanted to speak to sex workers directly and find out the voices of the people who were actually affected by policy and affected by law and affected by these debates and excluded from feminism in a lot of senses as well. So I started by doing a master's and then going on to do a PhD, which explored female sex workers, particularly their experiences around access to justice. And I did research here in Scotland, where we have a kind of semi-criminalised framework of law. Basically, the act of selling or buying sex is not illegal, but many of the ways around working are illegal. For example, working in pairs for safety, the two people can actually be prosecuted for running a brothel. Excuse me. So I started out doing that research. I then went to New Zealand and I explored women's experiences there around their access to justice and access to safety and also to support services under a decriminalised context where all adult consensual sex work is decriminalised. And really the results from that research just inspired me to go on and continue to investigate and problematize feminist views on sex work that were not in line with the safety of the people that were involved. I then was lucky enough to work globally with sex worker-led organisations around the world, mainly in high HIV prevalence countries. And my role there was around supporting sex workers to develop their own organisations and to lead on a kind of public health response with their knowledge of the community and their expertise, given that it was their lived experience. And that inspired me to come back and start Umbrella Lane here in Scotland. So Umbrella Lane started in 2015. Myself and a first board of people with lived experience of doing sex work. And we very much approached it that this would be a sex worker-led health and wellbeing project for sex workers. And in the past 6 years, we've now grown our network to over 500 sex workers throughout Scotland, and we support around issues of well-being, of support and safety, and of access to justice for sex workers here in Scotland.
Thanks for that. That's Jesus, you've really experienced it and done some great work. Could you just explain to someone who isn't very knowledgeable on the subject why we should legalise or regulate sex work? And just from a very basic perspective, so people can understand it before we go into the more detailed parts of the argument.
So for us, any form of criminalisation of sex work, ultimately, even when it's portrayed as a way to target people who are exploiting sex workers or people who are living off the profits of sex workers, the reality of any form of criminalisation is that it pushes the industry underground. And in doing that, it makes sex workers work in very precarious ways where they become vulnerable to violence. They feel that they cannot access enough support services for things like harm reduction and safety. And they feel very much unprotected by the law. So they feel that they're working away from a legal system that for us should be there to protect everybody, but particularly the sex workers who are working due to reasons of already experiencing marginalisation or vulnerability. And those are the people really that feel furthest away from the law when any form of criminalisation is in place.
Thanks for that. Earlier on, we were looking at legalised zones in the likes of Leeds, and you mentioned that there's actually a tolerance zone in Edinburgh. Could you expand on that and maybe explain why those sort of things would work in the future when we aim to regulate this sex work?
So basically, there was a tolerance zone that operated in Edinburgh for a number of years. It was an unofficial tolerance zone, but sex workers who were working on the street were working in an area that was actually very close to a police station, and they were allowed to work often in pairs in order to kind of keep each other safe, take down registration plates. Support service vans were out there, so they had health, needle exchange, access to even a comfortable warm place to have a tea and a coffee. And it was very much an accepted part of society at that point, and it was all about keeping predominantly women safe who were working in quite dangerous conditions out in the streets in Edinburgh. And MSP, a late MSP, Margot MacDonald, tried to bring forward a bill to make this into an official prostitution tolerance zone, which unfortunately was defeated. Therefore, the tolerance zone was then removed, and sex workers could then be arrested for solicitation on the streets. We saw at that point a 92% increase in violent attacks towards sex workers, who were then forced to go and work in, as we say, more precarious, more hidden, more dangerous ways, and kind of pushed out of the public view, which was seen as necessary to allow residents to enjoy being in that area. But actually what it was doing was really harming sex workers by pushing them into areas where they really were targeted for acts of violence. The tolerance zone in Leeds is not an area of expertise of mine, but from what I have read about it, and there's a great organisation there, and one really great activist who's been very vocal about the effects of that, have been very much reflective of what happened in Edinburgh at the time. Sex workers there working on the street feel that they have access to support and safety vans that are out in the evening when they're working. They have access to a warm and a comfortable place. They don't feel prosecuted or at risk of prosecution. They feel protected by the law and by the people that are there to carry out the law. So the police can walk by and just check that they're okay, rather than having to hide from the police or their clients hide from the police in order to avoid arrest. And when you're avoiding arrest, of course, your safety is not your priority. But when you're there and you're there legally, and at least at the very least, you're tolerated to be there and your work is being respected, then you can work by prioritising safety. You can take down registration plates. You don't need to rush negotiations with clients in a car. So you can even smell people's breath to check somebody's not been drinking. Take time to just assess the car environment, ensure there's nobody there hiding in the back, ensure the person doesn't have any sharp objects. These sorts of things are vital for sex workers' risk assessment of safety, and to allow legally people to carry out that risk assessment is vital, and it has been working in Leeds. It's led to better outcomes in terms of sex workers engaging with support services, feeling able to report violence against them, and also feeling able to engage with services when they're not comfortable in their work and they are looking for ways to maybe access welfare support or to access other opportunities to move on from sex work.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because a couple of years ago in Northern Ireland, we actually saw closer to home now, there was legislation introduced to crack down on sex work, and it actually led to an increase in human trafficking. So we have seen here at home that actually cracking down on this issue doesn't work. It has to be a much more understanding take. And just touching on the safety aspect of sex workers, Kate McGrew was telling us some interesting things about how COVID-19 has actually affected people in the sex work industry. Could you possibly expand on that and just tell us how it's affecting the people that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, and I think it's actually very similar to what was going on, and like Umbrella Lane was in a very similar position with SWAI, in that we had to react very quickly in terms of supporting our community through a crisis, and it was supporting our community through a crisis that was not recognised by the government as a community in need of support. So us as sex worker-led organisations really had to amp up our efforts through mutual aid, and it was a very difficult time for sex workers here in Scotland as well. So initially, before lockdown even began, of course, social distancing regulations came into place, and sex workers predominantly work in person. It's a touch-based industry, so we're already having to try and adhere to these public health regulations. They were doing so, however, without recognition of themselves as workers. So there was no state support apart from the self-employment insurance that came out. Now, many sex workers here in Scotland who are working in ways working together in pairs, which, as we've spoken about, is actually criminalised technically. They won't register as self-employed because they're too afraid of being criminalised and prosecuted for their work. Furthermore, many sex workers don't realise that they can register as self-employed. There's a lack of awareness about, because it's a grey area within the law, whether you can or cannot sell sex. Many people don't register as self-employed just because they are so concerned with hiding from any sort of state attention or surveillance on their work and for fear of prosecution. So sex workers really back then and then in lockdown were trying to adhere to the public health measures, as everybody was in Scotland, but were doing so without the financial protection that was offered to other workers. So what we did see was sex workers who were in a slightly better financial situation were able to adhere to public health measures, to stay home, to look after their children. We have many sex workers here who are mothers, predominantly single mothers, so many had to stay home and homeschool their children. But what we did see was that people were doing that and facing poverty at the same time, facing extremely difficult decisions around how to put food on the table, how to maintain a roof over their head. And with no government support around that. So Umbrella Lane developed a crisis fund very early on. We were very fortunate, and due to the efforts of our very small team and our volunteers, we raised over £26,000 and managed to support over 197 people with emergency payments throughout lockdown. I think this really helped our community. It gave us a bit of community strength and gave a lot of inspiration from mutual aid and looking after one another in Scotland. It was extremely unjust, however, that we were left to do that with no government support. And Umbrella Lane at the same time did a lot of advocacy to the government to try and secure financial to secure finances for our crisis fund to deliver to sex workers. These requests for that financial assistance were denied by the government. And in the end, the Scottish Government gave money to a group of organisations who are politically opposed to sex work to distribute funds across their network, to increase staffing costs within their projects, to provide trauma-informed support to sex workers. Now, Umbrella Lane does provide trauma-informed support. We also provide counselling and therapeutic services, but we work on a kind of basic hierarchy of need, which I'm sure everybody will understand. If you don't have your basic needs taken care of, you don't need to engage in counselling. You need financial support, and that financial support was denied to sex workers. I think the most frustrating thing at that point was one of our kind of lead people within the fight against the criminalisation of sex work, or not against it, sorry, for it, called coronavirus an opportunity to see sex workers lose their income and move into other forms of work. Now, for us and the people within our network, that felt extremely disregarding of the fact that people had immediate needs to meet for themselves and for their families. Also, the labour market, the job market at the moment for everyone, particularly young people, has completely shrunk. So to expect sex workers to lose their income from sex work and just swiftly move into other forms of employment was, just actually extremely frustrating to hear. And it felt very coercive that Scottish Government funding went into these kind of exit-based services rather than support services like Umbrella Lane, who could meet people where they were at and support people in meeting their basic needs at that point, before then having a conversation around how to move forward and out of coronavirus safely. So sex workers really felt extremely left behind. They still do. We're now going into a kind of second national lockdown in England that we see, and expecting the same in Scotland. Sex workers remain completely ignored by the government in terms of what public health measures can people put in place in terms of going back to work. And if they can't go back to work, or they're expected not to, what financial assistance is going to be available for people? Because at the moment it still seems to be none.
Yeah, Kate McGrew of the SWAI was explaining that there's a similar situation here where there was an anti-sex work lobby group given funding by the government, and the SWAI were left with nothing. And I think it's a moral issue opposed to a political issue. Like, there's people who are in serious need of help and they're not getting it. And fair play to yourself and Kate and the thousands of people who helped out over that. Just coming on from that, we see there that the government aren't exactly in support of this. Even here in Ireland, in 2013, Ógra Fianna Fáil, the youth wing of Fianna Fáil, passed a motion at our National Youth Conference to become pro legalisation and regulation of sex work. However, there's never really a conversation around sex work. That's a fair parallel to the fact that the Eighth Amendment had such a sway of support behind it by public reps, by social media influencers, by people on the streets, anyone.
Yeah.
Sex work doesn't receive that same sort of support, yet they're two issues of bodily autonomy. Would you have any insight into why sex work doesn't have that swell of support behind it?
I think it comes back very much to what I said in the beginning around this, being quite immersed in feminist research and feminist debates, and not understanding when it came to pornography and prostitution, how they became such divisive issues within feminism. It started, I think, back in the kind of second wave movement around the fact that we should be vilifying these as institutions. So the sex industry was vilified, the pornography industry was vilified. Within the 90s, I think that vilification really stepped up when there was a mass kind of, mainly from the West, influence conversation around trafficking, kind of this hyper media sensationalized debates around trafficking of women particularly. And before we knew it, they all kind of became enmeshed as one. So it was prostitution, trafficking, violence against women, rape, child rape. All of a sudden it was all of these things, and prostitution was caught up with that. I think it's taken until the sex workers' rights movement really fought back against that to actually look at the people who are involved and think, how can we vilify an industry without vilifying the people within it? And that's really what the sex workers' rights movement has I think, achieved in many places, by saying, yes, you can disagree with an industry and what that industry may represent to you, but in terms of the people within it, people have a right to bodily autonomy, people have a right to choice of livelihood, people have a right to public health and a right to safety. People have human rights, and those human rights have to be respected. I think in terms of kind of current day issues around sex work debates, like against kind of Eighth Amendment debates, I find that personally frustrating across this feminist divide, and why people, and particularly social influencers, can get behind one issue, not get behind another. And my personal insight is that there's an internalized whorephobia that all women suffer from. I think that we're born into a patriarchal society, and we're taught from a very young age that sexuality is something to be ashamed of, that in general is something to be ashamed of, never mind using it as a way to make an income. And I think that really becomes ingrained in all women, and we all suffer from what we call whorephobia, whether people are actually selling sex or not. So it's not an issue that people get behind lightly. What I have seen a real difference in, though, and it gives me a lot of hope, is young feminists who really are taking the issues of intersectionality seriously. And they're starting to think around, how has feminism being exclusionary to other areas of feminism that we should be looking at? And I think particularly things like Black Lives Matter, here we're now debating again with the Gender Reform Act and LGBTQI rights. I think that all of these kind of issues are issues where sex work should be prominent in those debates as well. I think with the Eighth Amendment, it's brilliant that everybody got behind it, but I hope that has now paved a way for people to then look at other areas of a lack of women's rights and a lack of people's rights in certain marginalised communities and certain groups, and how people can get behind that. It's a really frustrating thing as a feminist myself, to hear other feminists talk down about some women's choices, because for me as a feminist, I not only support all women's choices, But more importantly, I support women's safety in all of those choices. And for me, it's not a debate about bodily autonomy. It's not even a debate about choice. It's a moral debate about whether you keep people safe and you keep people healthy, or you choose to throw them under the bus more in terms of your ideology. So for an ideological purpose, you refuse to allow people to be safe.
Yeah, they're very fair points. And I suppose going forward as an organisation, we can definitely use them to better understand why people wouldn't be behind this issue, and maybe convince them to be on the right path to make sure that women are safer in this line of work.
We're counting on you young people. I think there's a real hope here that the tide is shifting. You know, this was a big prominent feminist debate in the 90s, and we're coming out of that. Many of the leaders of these organizations are going to be moving on soon. And for us, having the support of young, professional, progressive people who are wanting to become involved in politics is really key and important for us to be engaging with. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we're glad that you're engaging with us. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be able to speak to you. Just talking on the work that you do, the New Zealand model. A lot of people, when they hear that, they don't know what it is. Could you maybe explain to us in a few words what it is, and what's the benefits, what's the pros, what's the cons, and how we could possibly tweak it to suit Ireland or Scotland?
Yeah. Okay, so to start with what it is, so in New Zealand, they decriminalised prostitution in 2003 with something called the Prostitution Reform Act. Basically, the act came in to take all criminal legislation around prostitution away from sex work, so that all adult consensual sex work is regulated through health and safety laws and employment laws. So what it did was it allowed for up to 4 workers to work together in small cooperatives. So nobody was managing anybody, but 4 people could work together in a private dwelling, and they could operate their own business as independents, and with nobody needing to be a kind of manager within that setting. So it was a very kind of fair way for people to work independently, but still have the safety net of other people being around in the same place, and also the camaraderie, which I think people forget about working together. We see now working from home, it's isolating and it's lonely. So to allow people to work together in that sense was a huge positive for people. Also, brothels or managed premises became legal, but the person operating them had to have or apply for a brothel operator certificate. Now, to apply for one of them and be granted one, the person could not have a previous criminal conviction. So already that weeded out many people who might have been running these places who were not trustworthy or who had previous convictions. That brothel operator certificate also gave responsibilities for managers to ensure things like safer sex supplies were on the premises, that sex workers were aware of their rights. Within the PRA, the Prostitution Reform Act, sex workers also had the right to refuse any client for any reason without having to give a reason. So this gives sex workers a real sense of autonomy and agency in their work, being able to refuse clients. I think what the main thing that it did was, I think it did 2 main things actually. I think the first one is that it gave sex workers a real sense of the fact that the law was there should they need it. Since the Prostitution Reform Act came in, sex work was decriminalised. Sex workers have taken managers to employment tribunals who have sexually harassed them in work, for example, and won their case. Sex workers have prosecuted against clients who have removed a condom during a sex work transaction, which is actually also illegal within the PRA. I think the second biggest thing that it's done is that it's positioned sex worker-led organisations and sex workers as experts in their own lives. So the big sex worker-led organisation there, New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, is now funded by the Ministry of Health. It's a key partner in health and safety programming, and it ensures that sex workers are part of and at the table when decisions are being made about their lives. So when decisions around policy or health and safety frameworks or access to justice are being made, sex workers are there as the experts to say, these are the barriers, how do we get over them? The only con in my mind, and what's come out from the research about the New Zealand model, is that the current Prostitution Reform Act doesn't include migrant sex workers. So people who are migrant or on a student or a temporary visa in New Zealand cannot work in the sex industry. This was put forward as part of the legislation to through the argument that if you allow migrant sex workers to work in the industry, trafficking would increase tenfold. We've not seen that happening. Actually, trafficking statistics are extremely low in New Zealand, and actually even lower after decriminalisation. So that is something that I know that in New Zealand they're currently looking at, is whether migrant sex workers could be included in this protective legislation of the Prostitution Reform Act.
Oh, well, I think the way you put it across, it comes across very fair, and fairness is what we're always striving for in Olga Fianna Fáil, you know, an Ireland for all, a fair chance for everyone. But yeah, that's been a fascinating discussion. Anastasia, just thanks so much for coming today to talk to us, and we look forward to watching the work that you get up to over in Scotland, and hopefully we both win out the fight for a better tomorrow for sex workers. So yeah, I'd just like to thank you for coming along. And would you like to give your social media as a plug, the Umbrella Lane stuff or something like that?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, though, thank you very much for having me. And yeah, just as I said, seeing young future leaders of tomorrow in any place of the world take this on as an important issue, but also working with sex worker-led organisations and doing that is, yeah, gives us a lot of hope while we're kind of fighting quite a lot of the time on the front line, frustratingly, and sometimes making ourselves quite tired with it. So knowing that we have this politically, and political support is really, really important for us. Umbrella Lane can be found on Twitter, just at Umbrella Lane. We also have a Facebook page, again at Umbrella Lane, and an Instagram and a LinkedIn page as well. So please feel free to follow our socials, to get in contact if there's any information that we can provide or any future conversations that we can have. Yeah.
Thanks a million for that, Anastasia, and we hope to hear from you again soon.
Thank you.